starting at the top, tell me your life story pretty much. Again, with an eye towards the place where you grew up and, some of your earliest memories.
I grew up in North Dakota. That's my home state. I was born in 1931 on April 29th. And if my arithmetic is right, that makes me 87 now. And so my memory does go back quite a ways. I'm not the kind of person who thinks much about the past. The past is past, and I'm thinking ahead. So when you ask me to dredge up memories and pictures and all of this stuff from long ago, it's a struggle. I have to think about it, and I had to really hunt to find any pictures. But I do have some things along that we can share. And I do remember that the reason I brought the Shirley Temple doll along, because that is one of my first memories. My husband had a twin sister, and those two could get together, and I swear they could remember when they were 2 years old. But I can't. And I do remember that we were very poor when this is the Depression era, and we were living on a little farm that my dad had owned, and this was getting to be Christmas 1935 maybe, 35 or 36, 35, has to be 35. And he had gone to town Christmas Eve day, and up until that point, we didn't have any Christmas presents in our house. So he had gone to town, and that's when he did a little bit of purchasing. The only problem was there was a blizzard, and he had to stay in town, and he didn't get home until Christmas Day. And so I remember getting up and coming into the kitchen, and my mother saying, "Go and look on my bed. There's something there for you." I went in, and on the bed was this dolly. And then I came back out, and my mother said, "Well, why didn't you bring her?" And I said, "She's sleeping, because she has sleep eyes. And I wasn't going to disturb that pretty little dolly." And so she has traveled with me ever since. And if you want me to, I'll hold her up.
Yeah.
Okay. She's a little wobbly because she's old, and she's kind of wobbly because her elastic is failing. But that's her original hair and her original dress. Because my sister and I, who was 15 months older than I was, being Depression children, we didn't have a lot of toys. So there aren't too many survivors of my childhood. Didn't have many to survive. Being a farm kid, I was much more interested in little animals than toys, really. And our neighbor kids didn't have toys either. We didn't have bicycles, we didn't have skates, we didn't have a lake. This is dry North Dakota. And I said that we were living near Bowden. That's the town and I was born at home. This is the Depression, and it's the dry years. I have been told that there were 3 years in that part of North Dakota where they didn't even bother to take the binders out. There was no crop to harvest. My dad talked about feeding the cows Russian thistles. There was just nothing. And that just wasn't Minnesota. It was or North Dakota. It was Minnesota too, the whole Midwest. And that really was 1930 to 1934 were the worst years. We lost the farm. We moved in 1936. My sister had already started school. She was born in January, so she had started early. So that made her 2 years ahead of me, although we were only 14 months apart. And there's lots of stories about that, but anyway, we were farm kids. And my dad often had a hired man, but we didn't help a lot. He didn't believe in girls in the barn, except when he needed me to help. Sometimes it was an animal emergency. And I had known I was going to be a nurse from little on, so I was the one that would help when a calf had to be pulled or a baby lamb was born out in the pasture in the rain and was cold and had to come in the house. I remember my mother and I sewing up a pig one time that had gotten stepped on. So, you know, it's a couple of my pictures I have I have one of the pet sheep. It's with cousins, and the sheep and the dog and the cats are all part of the family. And I was usually the one kind of responsible for all the extra pet lambs. If a ewe had 3, she would take care of 2. So I would get the extra lamb to be my responsibility. So that was a lot of bottle feeding, bottle washing. We had a milking machine, not a milking machine, a crank type cream separator. The cream would go to town, it would go in a can. When the can got full, it went to town, and you swapped the cream for groceries. And that was the little town of Hickman, which is our post office and maybe 4 or 5 miles away. Bowdoin, where we had lived before, was closer to 14 miles away. Where we would eventually go to high school was like 15 miles away. This is back in the day with no bus transportation. So when we went to country school for 8 years, our parents and the neighbors, we would take turns with transportation. Sometimes it was by car, sometimes it was by sled. Just depended on the snowfall. High school was in Pheasanton, North Dakota, and that was 4 good years. I remember some of my townie classmates. One guy in particular was a little resentful of these country kids coming in and getting good grades because he was used to being the star. And we had a few little arguments about that kind of situation. My sister and I stayed with people in town. We lived in town. You couldn't go home every day when you had no bus system. So we would do light housekeeping and stay in town. And I seemed to always be a bookworm, and I always got pretty good grades. And my sister was older, but the social one. And I had to tattle and say, well, Tootie would get better grades if she took her books home and she studied a little bit. So she had to mend her ways a little bit because I tattled. And finally, we both got through high school, off to college. She went first. We both went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. That's a Lutheran church facility where they take pretty good care of you, living in a dorm and so on. And I started she was in home ec, so that's what 4 years she was a home ec teacher. I started in a 5-year nursing program. You would get a bachelor's degree and then be eligible to become a registered nurse. But that program evaporated right in the middle of my enrollment. And so I was the only one of my class that decided I'm going through with this. I'm going to end up with a degree and I'm going to go to the hospital for nursing. So a small private college like that, they will make little accommodations. They just had to poop up what I had to take. I had to have a language. I had to have X number of credits and this and that, and enough to be able to say I had a major and a minor completed. So I was taking like 20 credit hours at a time, and summer session, and a correspondence course, and I got a lot crammed into 2 years in the summer. And then I was off to 3 years at Fairview Hospital in Minneapolis, and graduated from there in the spring of the year. And then, because my parents had spent a lot of time and money getting me through school, they were tired of saying, people would say, well, so-and-so is a nurse and it took her 2 years, or so-and-so is a nurse and it took her only 3 years. What's Arlene doing? So I was going to not only graduate from Fairview with pomp and circumstance, I was going to Concordia and put on a cap and gown and graduate with pomp and circumstance, which we all did in our family. And I didn't know anybody. I walked with my cousin, and she happened to be a student also there. So we were Fortneys together, and we marched in. I didn't know anybody, except the registrar who handed me my diploma and shook my hand, because it was with his connivance that I was able to accumulate enough credits to graduate. I also had to go to summer school, night school, not summer schools, night school at the University of Minnesota, because I had had all these biology, bacteriology, histology classes in college, so they didn't make me take the Mickey Mouse nurse science classes. Then I went over to the university and picked up a couple credits I needed in something or other and started in on the public health nursing sequence. So then I finally got through with that, took my first job in North Dakota in public health. I was at Devils Lake, North Dakota, which is in Ramsey County. I was in a 3-county health department, health unit, or whatever they called it. So there were 2 other counties. County nurses in that era, in that part of the world, you were Lone Rangers, a county nurse. I had, 40, 50 country schools to visit. And there was an epidemic of ringworm. And so practically the only thing I did was drive around in this old Chevy agency car that was provided to me and visit country schools. And I had something called a woods light, which is an infrared lamp of some sort, and we would have to go in the coal bin or put a cover over the windows in the book room or something to get a dark room, and then sit the kid down, and if the head fluoresced, you knew you had scalp ringworm. So, whatever the disease is, you deal with. And the other thing I remember happening, Devils Lake, North Dakota was close to Indian country. It wasn't part of the reservation, but there were Indian folks living there. And some of them ended up in jail. And there was a lot of tuberculosis that was still active all over then. So I had to go to the jail and give streptomycin shots to prisoners. So I kept busy, and I don't remember having any kind of clerical help. So all the record keeping, we would, each of us in our own respective county in this health unit would do for ourselves. When I started that job, we had a pretty respectable staff. We had a gentleman who had a master's degree in public health from Michigan, I believe. We had an engineer and a milk person who did the dairy inspections. And then that was for the 3-county area. And then each county had their own nurse. And we did work together on immunizations in our larger schools and so on. Those 2 gentlemen, supervisors, moved on to greener pastures, and then the powers that be promoted the sanitary engineer. The sanitary, engineer, come on, he had an 8th grade education. He was the milk sanitarian, and he was telling me how to boil my syringes and needles. And I thought, this is not exactly the kind of career I'm looking for. So I went shopping, and I ended up as the McLeod County nurse, which was fine because my sister was living, she had married and was living in Minnesota at that period of time. So that was handy. And then the neighboring county of Sibley had a new nurse also. The 2 of us would ride together to our meetings, regional meetings in Mankato, and her boyfriend knew my eventual husband, and so I think we had a blind date arranged for us. And that's how I met my eventual husband. And I think we were married. I had to look this up. I told you once that I have selective memory, and I figured out I was married in 1957, which is a long time ago, and we were together. He died in 2012, so that was well over 50 years. So my memories of lots of things go way back. We did not have the blessings of children, so we were free to do all sorts of things. Once he retired, first, it's this building business. Uncle Sam made an electrician out of him. Being a farm kid, he was kind of mechanically inclined and pretty smart. And he graduated from high school in 1943. His father, who had been a World War I veteran with a pretty nasty tour of duty in France, said to Bob, "You will enlist in the Navy." So he did, and had a little trip to the South Pacific in the 40s, and he served as an electrician's mate, which made him employable when he got back from service. Only he got sick, and he ended up in the Veterans Hospital, and they said that crawling around and wiring cold attics is not the kind of job you need, so try something else. So his uncle was sheriff at Shakopee in Scott County, and he knew of an opening in Sibley County. The clerk of court was relieved of his duties for a little malfeasance of some sort, and so Bob was the present deputy became the clerk, and Bob was the new deputy. This was 1950. And he lived at home, and he commuted over to Gaylord to his new job at the courthouse. 1950s is when the ditching started and when Social Security was available to farmers. So he had varicosities in his legs, and he said it was from standing at the counter, waiting on all the people angry about ditches and all the farmers coming in. Now I can get Social Security, but I was born at home and I don't really have any documentation. But you have to provide that, so school records, church records, a lot of that trekking on went on in the courthouse in those years. And we had vacations. We went through the tent stage and the camper stage and the cabin stage, and then he finally retired. Well, we had to build a house first, you know how that goes, and a do-it-yourself kind of project. His dad helped us, and I think we had a carpenter a little bit, but Bob figured out how to build things. And then we had to build a garage, and then pretty soon we decided we had to build a cabin, and then we decided paying taxes on the farm, which he ended up owning his grandparents' farm. And then so we had taxes on a house in Gaylord, taxes on a cabin, and taxes on a farm. So when he retired, then we decided we would move to the country, which we were both country kids anyway, so that sounded pretty good. And so we built yet another building, and that's how I got into this business with the book, the Blue Book. While we lived in Gaylord, and Bob was working at the courthouse, I was working at the hospital part-time, but because of our running around with the cabin and all that, I didn't work a regular schedule. But I helped with various things. I got called for emergencies in the emergency room, or the delivery room, or the operating room, or take a trip to Minneapolis or take a trip to Rochester with a patient. In the early years, those trips were by hearse. We weren't so fancy as to have an ambulance, so that means throw everything you need in a pillowcase and hang on to the oxygen tank and pin the IV to the headliner, and away you go. Sometimes on the wrong way on a one-way street when you are unfamiliar with where the driver is taking you. So yeah, I had some interesting years. And then we decided in the community to put an addition on the hospital, a nursing home addition. And so I got involved with that. Several of us made trips around to see other hospitals, other nursing homes. What do we want when we build our nursing home? And so furniture decisions, spacing decisions, equipment, we did the shopping list and fought with the architects. We shall not have carpeting on the floors in the lobbies. Absolutely no carpeting. Oh, come on. You want carpeting. No. Elderly people have accidents. And we were in too many places where it smelled bad. You know, you live and learn. So we ended up with with real gatch beds. They thought, you know, you could get by with dormitory style beds. No, no. We want beds that you can elevate your patient's head, legs, and so on, which proved in the long run to be very necessary, because if people are going to be in a nursing home, they need bedside care at times. But enough of that. And then I used to be invited to train the new nurses' aides for the hospital or the nursing home. So we'd have classes. And I think one of my broken records with the administrator was saying, please, please hire middle-aged mothers, not 18-year-old girls, because they can do more than one thing at a time. They can think of more than one thing at a time. And they worry about the patients. They don't worry about their own break and their own meal. Makes a huge difference. And we generally had good staffing. Pleasure to work with. Enough about that. Now what shall we talk about?
Well, still in Gaylord here.
Okay,
and,
in Gaylord, yes, and I had time enough, and remember 1976 centennial of the United States, the directive went out all over the country, review your history, review your history. So in the community of Gaylord, well, we should have a history book. We should review our history, we should celebrate. So the newspaper editor, and I think he was the young principal at the Lutheran Parochial School, they were going to be the committee and get this started. And a month later, we had another meeting, and they said, you know, this is too much of a job. We can't do this. We started in 1882 as a community, and that's a lot of years, up to 1976. So a different committee was formed. 5 years later, we cranked out a book called Henderson, or called Gaylord, Hub of Sibley County. 500 pages with an index, pre-computer, completely. That was put together at the newspaper office, one page at a time, published at Crow River, and I thought when we reached the end of that, never again. Then we moved to the country when Bob retired, and we're building this house, and I was, you know, when you move away that much, that distance, you lose contact with your church, or your clubs, your friends, so I was bored. I needed something to do. So I went into Henderson exploring, and I talked to the city clerk, and there was an economic development committee, and and this is my husband's home community. He graduated from high school here. And so I said, well, I've had a little experience with a history book. What about the history here? And so we got a committee going. And 5.5 years later, we have a book. And computers were coming into being. There was a young man named Mike Reinhardt who lived in town here. And he happened to be working in a business where he had to learn to use a computer in this business office. And so the Hagans, who ran the Closing of the Gap here in town, they loaned the city office a computer, an early Apple. And Mike sat at that in the evening when he got home from working out of town. And we on the book committee, a couple of us would be there with him. And he would take the typescript, because we got a lot of stuff in written by hand, and then that would be converted to typing, and then we'd hand him the manuscript, and he would enter it into the computer. That was the era of the floppy disk. And Carmen was our typist. She had worked for Green Giant in the business office, so she was an excellent typist. She cranked out these manuscripts. She'd stand there peering over Mike's shoulder as he was doing this entry. Return the, she wanted him to do this, like you do with a typewriter. And no, Carmen, it doesn't work that way, it does it by itself. So we had a lot of fun getting this stuff put together. And that history book is the work of many people.
Could you hold it up a second?
Yes. This is, I don't know who started calling it the Blue Book, but I think we picked the color blue because of the river, and the river, you know, the picture and so on. So that's why that choice was made. And in the front part of it, you know, I have to look at this because I don't remember all this stuff. It said that we started having these major committee meetings to kind of talk about the book in 1990, but we were already working on it because it got published in 1994. So
There's a little blurb, at least on the back of this edition, from the mayor, and you talked about contribution.
Yeah, I don't even remember what's in the back of that one. That was done a few years later when we ran out of copies.
From the newspaper. It seemed like it was, you know, very much a collaborative effort.
Oh,
a
yes.
lot of people involved. Could you talk about that a little bit in terms of how the book came together?
Well, every organization, every business was asked to contribute. We had an editing process. We would collect these manuscripts from the different organizations, handwritten or whatever, and we did some interviews. We had an in-gathering of pictures. Somebody from the University of Minnesota came out with a good camera and took pictures for us. A lot of them came from the Sibley County Museum. A lot of them was an in-gathering in the community with newspaper requests. You all come and bring your pictures, and interviews were done on the same day. And some of us did a little bit more writing than others of the editing committee. And then Don O'Sell, if you might have noticed his name in there, he cranked out a chapter. Lon Berberick was the city clerk at the time, still is, and he did all the city material, and that's a big hunk of it. Well, just a lot of people helped a lot. And then we would meet once a week and have an editing session, and we would argue about the funniest things. I remember we were talking about the parks in one session, and I think I had written some little paragraph that had the term potable water being available in the park. And somebody said, "Oh, that's an awful word. We can't say that." They didn't understand potable water didn't have anything to do with, you know, chamber pot and going potty. So, you know, we had fun arguing about things. And it finally came together.
It must have been a great sense of accomplishment when it...
Yes, it was. It was.
And did you...
But there still was not a computer program for indexing. That hadn't happened yet. And the Hagans, who have a computer-based business at that time, they tried in the worst way, and they said there just is nothing to help. So that was indexing. There's 16 pages of index, and it's subject headings and names. I think a lot of that happened on sheets of plywood on sawhorses in my basement. You know, we'd go through a book and underline. We had a loose paper copy from the printer first, from Crow River Press. So we had something to mark up the loose signatures and so on. And so that was an assist in the indexing process. And I'm still angry at myself when I look for something in that blasted index, because I know it's in the book, but it's not indexed. Like something about wagon train one time, I needed that. Or something about oxen, I needed that. I couldn't remember what section it was in. So now I have to hunt for some things. And my index has got a lot of notations in it.
Now I understand there is to be an update.
Yes, we're calling it a sequel.
And you know, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, we have kind of a little embryonic committee going, and a couple of people have submitted manuscripts. We're waiting for people who are involved to be a little less busy so we can have a couple of meetings and get some material and get started. one of the things that I want to work on, Doug Thomas has already done a beginning of producing a manuscript about the buildings, the renovation up and down Main Street, in town, and the schools, and a few things that he's been involved in. And then we need to bring the business changes, building changes on Main Street up to date. And there was a book that Dolores Hagan produced with a grant for the Preservation Commission in 2006. So that's was brought up to date from the Blue Book to that publication, but there's still a lot of changes between 2006 and 2018.
And you have involvement also from something that's been around almost as long as the town itself, the newspaper. And
the newspaper has been the source of practically everything in terms of history that's in this book has been based on research. We've read every newspaper, every back issue of every newspaper available.
What's the name of the paper?
It started out in Henderson, the first Joe Brown's paper, April 1857, the Henderson Democrat. And that paper was going until the 1860s, and then it went away for a while. It lasted a little bit longer, but no issues were saved. So we have a gap of about 12 years with no paper. Then in the 1870s, there were two papers for a while, and the Sibley County Independent and the Henderson Times, I think the other one was called. That didn't last long. Sibley County Independent remained the paper from 1870-something until after the county seat moved to Gaylord, and then the editor said, well, I guess we have a community building instead of a courthouse, and we better change the name to the Henderson Independent, not the Sibley County Independent.
Pretty great. And you mentioned that there was, the original book, and then about 10 years later, you had a little bit of an update, and now it's,
and we still have, I think, about 400 copies of the reprint edition. So when we get the sequel done eventually, there's a whole generation of people in the community that were not around. Maybe their parents bought a book, but they don't personally have one. So there may be an opportunity for a sale of those. And the owner of the material is the Henderson Ladies Tourist Club. The city of Henderson holds the copyright, but there's no issue about, using it.
Tell me a little bit about that tourist club.
The tourist club, it's the second oldest organization in Henderson. Goes back to the 1890s. Fire department is older. And at one period of time, it used to have 25 members, at least. Professional women, school teachers, tended to be very much involved. It was called the Tourist Club because they traveled by reading books. People didn't travel then like we do now. So it was a lot of armchair travel. And the name has persisted, and some of the programming has persisted.
It seems that they've, been involved.
Yes, it is a federated club, so there's a state and regional and international angle to the club. And we have an officer who has, what they always say, moved up the chairs, and so some of us just want to keep the club going. There's too much going on. People just can't join everything, and so membership in everything in a small town is competitive, and people have to do what pleases them the most. So we have a hard time keeping a very large membership. Too much going on.
There's a vibrancy to the community. It seems like from the time when you moved from Gaylord and were more active here.
Well, we lived in
the
the country for 20 years and did a little more traveling then. I was less involved. Well, no, that's not quite true, because that's when I got involved with doing the book. So yes, being it was my husband's hometown, and he knew everybody, and so you just get acquainted. I've kept some of my old friends from Gaylord. I traveled with them, and life goes on. More recent changes in the community since this book was done, 25 years, going to be in 2019. There's more travel away from the community. There's more commuting. There's less jobs within the town. There's businesses that have gone away. There was a time, even when this book was done, when there were several restaurants, when there were several grocery stores. Churches were very active, big attendance every Sunday. People leave more, go away weekends more. Back in the day when travel was a little more difficult, I'm thinking, way back to gravel roads and so on, bad weather, people just stayed in their local area more. Now with good cars, good roads, attractions like Twin City affairs, baseball, Twins games, Vikings games. There's people that go to those things. There's theaters. There's a lot of activity at Mankato, college towns. St. Peter has a lot of things going on. People just go. And activities change within a community. The most recent phenomenon, and I'm sure you'll be getting to that when you talk to people like Jeff Steinborn, is this love affair with automobiles. The Tuesday night roll-ins have just become an enormous thing in the community. It's entertainment. It's a business opportunity for our Main Street people. Motorcycles, cars, hundreds of motorcycles, hundreds of cars. It's a phenomenon, unlike any other place in Minnesota, I understand. Changes in agriculture. 160 acres used to be a farm. That's what people homesteaded on. That's what they claimed by preemption when this end of the county was settled. Nobody can make a living on that anymore. Instead of 160 acres, it might be 2,060 acres, 5,060 acres. Farming operations are entirely different. The crops are not diversified. Corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans, no diversification. And that is getting detrimental to the quality of our ground. There's some issues with erosion of fields, fertilizer contamination. There's a whole new set of problems coming because of the way agriculture is being conducted. They don't want to take all the blame because we've paved over an awful lot of ground too in our cities, and our sidewalks, and our love with asphalt driveways. So it's a shared responsibility for what we're doing to our land. And so I'm sure when we do the reprint or the sequel to the Henderson book, there'll be another good chunk on agriculture.
I look forward to seeing that. There's one other little phenomenon that I see evidence of on Main Street here, a mural and a whole bunch of purple things.
Oh yes. Joel King is an interesting person. He's the one responsible for this love affair with Prince. He was 30 years behind a camera in Hollywood. He is a Minnesotan, but spent 30 years in California as a photographer. And he's retired now and in Henderson. And he did film a movie with Prince, so he knew him personally. And then Purple Rain was filmed partly out in rural Henderson, across the river. There's a scene where something about it ain't Minnetonka, or something like that. I don't know. I've never seen the film, but people tell me what's in it. And then I told you about Josh Reinitz and his mother, Cindy. Josh was a kid at the time. Cindy was living on the farm out there, and I think that the motorcycles were roaring around in their pasture, and one of them flipped in cow pie. And so, the whole neighborhood out there was part of the drama. And I think there's something about coming into town to try to get a blanket for this wet lady who had been in the river. And there was nobody in town selling blankets, so I don't know what they did.
A couple of things that I don't know got into the original book, and they have to do with education. And one right down the road here and another across the river. Could you talk about?
Are you talking about the merger of the school? And then the charter school phenomenon?
It would be nice to hear about that merger.
Well,
but then also
the merger of Le Sueur and Henderson I think we have the last graduating class mentioned of pure Henderson. And then that building was pretty much abandoned when the school combined. And then about the same period of time, in the very beginnings of the charter school system, is happening over in Le Sueur in a couple of empty storefronts. And then over time, then there's a lovely new charter school, high school building close to the river near the bridge. And then one of the many remodeling projects that has gone on in this town that I've been involved with a little bit. I was involved with the drugstore rehabbing, and also my husband was still living then and was able to provide a lot of sweat equity. When we got around to the renovation of the old Henderson High School building, built in 1900, I was able to help a bit with that. And he had died by that time, but I knew he'd want some involvement, that I would be involved. And that was fun. And that's where the little kids are. So we have the upper campus and the lower campus. Don't we sound fancy? And then we have Hilltop Elementary, which was built, and there are pictures of it and story of its being built and named is in the old blue history book. And that is now part of the Le Sueur Henderson system, of course, and that is a STEM school, science and technology and so on. And I just heard on the radio that girls are doing better than boys, even in the STEM programs, which were supposed to have been, the bailiwick of boys once upon a time. So how about that?
Pretty good. And the school that's right on the river, tell me again what that's called and the grades.
The Minnesota New Country School. And I think the faculty and board, when that building was constructed and the school was designed, I think they were thinking of kind of the way the country schools operated as being the system that they would like, where it's a cooperative thing between the teacher and the students help each other. I could go on and on about what it was like to go to country school. But that's kind of, it's more family style. The kids do the cleaning, they do the janitor work, they help with the meals. It's a cooperative affair. It's not like the way public schools operate. They don't even call themselves teachers, they're advisors. And the kids and the parents individually kind of plan their own way through. And I would say they get some very outstanding students who do academically very well and go on to some pretty spectacular roles in the world. And they also have some kids that get lost in the shuffles in the public school system, where the classes are large and they don't get individual attention. They hold the class sizes pretty small, and there's always a waiting list in both facilities for the little kids and the high school, and it's by lottery when the kids get in. That's the law. So there might be a child who is commuting from Mankato or Timbuktu who gets in as a kindergartner And a child who lives a block away doesn't. So that's created a little hard feelings. But the lottery is the legal way that children can be admitted to a school when the enrollment is at maximum.
Sounds like it's a real source of pride for the community.
Well, it just depends on your opinions, I guess. Some people prefer their children to go to the public school, and some people like the charter school approach. So, and sometimes it's mixed in a given family. So, whatever works.
And then the other, it's an environmental education facility?
Across the river is the NIE. It's called, they've simplified it. It's just the NIE Nature Center now. And that is part of the park system of LeSueur County, even though it has a Henderson address and it's within spitting distance across the river. And that is growing in size and scope of curriculum and staffing, doing very well.
Excellent. Could you talk just a little bit, partly we've gone over some of the new things that you'll need to add to the book. If you're dreaming about amenities or new things that might happen in the future that would make Henderson a better place, do you have visions about things that could happen?
Well, it's hard to know what's even possible anymore because the shopping habits of people have changed. Once upon a time, every little town had a car dealership or two. Every little town had a machinery place. Now with Amazon and Walmart and these big box stores, in shopping malls, it's just an entirely different thing. People think nothing of running to Mankato to shop for something, that was just unheard of years ago. And it'll never come back. Maybe if there was some specialty thing that developed on Main Street, like Dee Thomas's glass shop, she's attracting people and they come on their motorcycles on Tuesday night, and the ladies walk in there, and while we're on the motorcycle, I can't shop today, but we'll come back with a car, and that makes a difference. I think people go into our hardware store and think, an oiled floor? Haven't seen that for 100 years. We've got some quaint places. There's still buildings that have got the tin ceilings, the Roadhouse does. It makes Henderson kind of a unique place, and thanks to some pretty clever updating of the buildings on Main Street, they're pretty much back to looking like they started out in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Our oldest building on Main Street is from 1862. Used to have court upstairs there. It was multiple uses of buildings.
So as long as we're going back to that history, maybe we could wind up here with just a little bit about the origins of the town, who started it, and why did he look at this particular location as a good place to put a town?
Joseph Renshaw Brown is really responsible for the establishment of Henderson. He was a young man bored with his job as a printer's apprentice out in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, and he ran away from his responsibility, got himself to Philadelphia, enlisted in the Army. 1820, he's out here where Fort Snelling would eventually be established. So he grew up in the frontier. He was 15 and limited education, but genius intelligence, I would guess, just smart man. And he saw all sorts of opportunities. He was in the Army for about he left 1826, I think, became a fur trader with the Indians. And eventually he became acquainted with Henry Sibley. They were both good Democrats, and political life was beginning to beckon, and so there's a long history there. But getting to the point where he was expanding his horizons in business, and he knew the government was going to be establishing Fort Ridgely in 1853, and he saw an opportunity for business, and so he decided he would establish a community on the river and maybe get some traffic going over to that wilderness where that fort was going to be. That was just prairie and wilderness, occupied by Indians mostly. And so he landed, he knew the Minnesota River. He had traveled up and down, across country and on the river. And he tried to buy acreage a little bit north of here that was a better, drier spot. And $400 was the asking price, and he said no. So he just moved a little farther along and said, this is where the town's going to be. And he brought in a crew, and they laid out the Henderson to Fort Ridgely Trail. And that was in 1852, and that was the beginning of Henderson. One log cabin and one road.
And then I think I read in the Blue Book here that, where Highway 19 is now, there was an advantage
yes,
for that.
You're right. That was the choice because the banks were so steep in so many places in the horse and buggy and wagon era that it was difficult to get out of the valley. And there was a pass here that was usable. And it's called the Fort Road, and it's still there. It's gravel part of the way, and 19 follows a little bit of the original path, but not all of it. And there is a book called the Henderson to Fort Ridgely Trail book that was published for the bicentennial by the Sibley County Historical Society in 1976. And then there's a reprint of that that's got major footnotes that adds information. Ollie Redman was the original author, and he did not have the availability of the computer. He didn't have all sorts of assets that are available now, like the road calendar. He didn't know about Adam Buck did a Sibley County road calendar in 1870s. He didn't know about that. So, we have maps that say old road, new road, that kind of thing, which he did not have. But with today's technology, a reprint of that book was possible using exactly his language, but amplifying it with footnotes and some additional chapters.
So speaking of footnotes, is there anything that you would like to add? Is there something that I didn't ask you about or you thought of that you would like to conclude with?
Just that I'm happy to be living here. I enjoy the community. I'm, as I said in the beginning, I'm 87, and I know a lot of people younger than I am who are not in as good a health as I am, who are not able to live independently, but I do. I enjoy that. One of my best possessions is my library card, and I'm spending volunteer time here and there, and I have a reason to get up in the morning, reason to get out of bed.
I don't think you can end up any better than that. Wonderful.